Thank you to Walker and the Strand for hosting us. I'm so happy to be here with August. And you should all buy his book as well, Anyone's Ghost. It's brilliant. I thought I would begin by just reading the very beginning of the novel, because none of you have read it. And this doesn't require me to give you any context. I say that, but I'm about to give you some context, which is that the book begins in 2022 and very quickly goes back to 2002. So you're not really in this timeline for very long. The narrator, James, is kind of, you learn, going through a divorce. And he's looking back over his life and kind of trying to figure out what went wrong. And yeah. Time runs faster backwards. The years, long, arduous, and uncertain when taken one by one, unspool quickly, turning liquid. So one summer becomes a shimmering light that, almost as soon as it appears in the mind, is subsumed into a dark winter, a relapse of blackness that flashes to reveal a face, a fireside, a snow-encrusted garden. And then the garden sends its snow upwards into the sky, gathers back its fallen leaves, and blooms again in reverse. The faces smile at me back there, at the far end of the reel. They are younger, more innocent, lighter. If, now that I am in my adulthood, time seems like a silted riverbed I cannot wade through, I find more often than before that I can spin it backwards, can turn it into a flow of waters, warmer, sweeter, washing the years away, carrying me with them. And if, one day, perhaps, sitting at my desk, puzzling over a photograph or some snatch of memory, I start to float down that river, I might go past the meadows in season, hear laughter coming like a clear bell from somewhere, someone, or maybe a sharp voice raised against me. There are intervals of light and dark overhead, like the sun breaking through willows, and it always brings me back here, one year when I am 16 years old. And I see in this dream, or this imagined reversal, a family standing there, and sometimes on the other bank of the river, a lone boy who might nod to me in recognition, or who might just as easily turn his back and walk across the fields into the sunrise, into the morning, and be gone. Invariably, I see those years as a sort of morning, the pink sun lifting over the village, mist burning off the canal, off the fields which are damp with dew, the sound of birds waking with song, the clean streets empty of people who are only just beginning to rouse, the sun's light just starting to slant through the bedroom windows and across their closed eyelids. Of course, I am here now, in a future of sorts, and I find that I cast all of those images with my shadow, watching them replay, skipping over a day or a week or a month to find the moment again when the scene joins up, becomes significant, which is to say, it begins to mean something to me now. Sometimes the years spin like this all of a sudden. I might be walking along a street and notice a smell, or see a stranger and mistake them for someone else, and then I am back there in the village. Or else I will find myself in a long chair in an office, spinning back time on purpose, searching for something, like a detective going over and over the gathered evidence in search of some missed clue. Often, back there when the spinning stops and I find my family gathered at the dining table, or my mother in the garden sunbathing, or Eddie knocking at my bedroom door, calling my name, I might ask myself if these people are alive. Of course, they think they are alive, and I cannot tell that I am here in the future watching them. They do not know me now, years beyond them, still waiting for one of them to sense my presence in the room, or in the garden, or beside the bed, and to turn their gaze onto me and smile. Not long ago, I was at home alone, and I was searching online for images of the village where I had been born. I had been doing this more often recently, hoping to find the answer to something unfinished, some thread of my life that was unraveling all these years later. I was clicking through pages and pages of photographs, items of the local news, and this time I saw the lot on an auctioneer's website, and before I knew what I was doing, I was dialing the agent's number. Late 18th century farmhouse, 4 bedrooms, including outbuildings and 6 acres of land, Green Lane, Thornmere. The words were like a talisman. Just seeing them, I was back there in those deep lanes, the towpath by the canal, the smell of the hawthorn blossom, and that potholed path down to the old farm where I'd used to wait decades ago for him. I had thought it would be painful to be reminded, but what I felt instead was a sort of collapse in time, a possibility, a curious but strong sense that my old life might still exist there, that if I went back, I might find those people that summer, all going on there still, unharmed and unchanged. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading that. It's such a beautiful opening and so perfectly tone-setting for all the wonderful meditations that are to come. It reminds me of this obscure French writer named Marcel Proust, who I like. And it has this... You're so good at reflecting on time and the way that the senses move us through time, both consensually and non-consensually. This opening sets up the framing of the novel, which is this man looking back at his life, as you said, as he's getting divorced. And I'm curious what made you start it in 2022 and then move back 20 years instead of just diving right in.
Yeah, so I actually dove right in. I began with just this 2002 section in which you have the main character, James, who's about 16 years old, and another character called Luke, who James kind of falls in love with. And there were 2 reasons, really. One is that I knew I wanted an adult voice to write with, so giving it a frame meant that I could cast it in retrospect. But 2, it became important to me to have a narrator who was trying to piece together their life. Like, it couldn't be an immediate narration. It had to be one in which there were gaps and holes. And you might get the sense as you read the book that the narrator is not necessarily to be trusted at all times. I might be missing some aspects of his memory. So then I was in a cafe in Providence, Rhode Island, of all places, and that the first line of the book kind of came to me, and over that day I wrote the prologue to the book, and then it became very clear to me that kind of shifted the whole narration of the book into one in which there was doubt cast over the story that you're told. So, yeah.
Well, shout out to Providence, Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I feel like the frame adds this wonderful and tragic, elegiac tone that, you know, a lot of novels dive right in, as we said, and maybe that creates a different kind of urgency, but it felt so essential to putting all this together. Another sort of framing device that you use is the book is primarily set over 1 year and separated into 4 seasons. In 2002. I found it to be incredibly effective. I'm very bad at structure, so I like to just latch on to things like a calendar or whatever. What was your sort of intent in doing that, and did it make the writing easier? Did you always plan to do it?
Yeah, that was like one of the first decisions I made on the book. I knew I tend to not really have chapters, because I think chapters kind of require a certain pace of plot, and I wanted longer segments. So the seasons were in right at the start because I knew that I would limit the time in which these boys have together to a year. And I knew that beginning in autumn and going winter, spring, summer was itself a sort of plot, because you begin in kind of darkness and endings, and then isolation, and then you begin to kind of blossom and go into light. That's not necessarily the plot of the story, but it is a sort of plot that runs underneath the story. And, you know, if I'd have reversed that begun in the summer and ended in winter, there would have been a completely different book. So in that way, it just helps to give yourself a movement and an atmosphere. But it also ended up helping me to write the book. I drafted the book over 1 year originally, and I wrote the autumn when it was autumn. I kind of did like a method writing thing. And the winter in the winter, and it meant that if I was ever stuck for the atmosphere that I was trying to get through, I could just kind of go outside and pull it in. And so I was trying to get something of the vividness of the seasons into the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt as though it also added this really wonderful kind of suspense, because you know exactly when things are going to end. You infer that this is only a year. So there's kind of this ticking clock that made, for this anxiety. So it's so interesting to hear that you method wrote this. I was very curious. You all heard his very lengthy bio. He's a very impressive man among us. And I'm curious why you chose to write this as a novel, and why a novel now, this far into your career.
Yeah, I think some ideas just come as novels. It couldn't really be anything else. One, because it was fictional as an idea. You don't believe me. And two, because when I write a poem, I ideally want to kind of get the shape and energy of it down in a day, and you can't get a novel down in a day, so it's an exercise in a much longer period of time. I'd always wanted to write a novel, but I'd always kind of looked at people like yourself and thought I couldn't do that, because everything that I'd written before had come, like, real life was the source material for it, whether it was a poem or whether it was memoir. And I didn't really trust that I could invent something without it feeling invented. And for a long time, as I was writing this novel, maybe for the first 3 months or so, it just felt made up. And then it gradually became like almost more real than real life. And that was at the point that I had some confidence in it. I didn't feel that I was just being silly, making up stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what's interesting being a reader is that you receive novels in this kind of perfect form, right? You read them when they're done, and you hope that they're pretty good and all that. And your writing is so accomplished on the line-to-line level. I'm curious if there were parts of this that were easy to write, where you felt as though you were just sort of like floating with it, and if there were parts that were arduous. I find most of life arduous, so I'm curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, that part I just read was easy to me. It came out in a flow. I always think if you can get yourself into that kind of flow state, it usually comes out better, because you're not seeing the nuts and bolts and the awkwardness of it. I found the scenes difficult, and what I mean by that is I never planned what would happen in a scene before I started writing it, and so I would kind of get so far in a scene and then think, no, I don't know where I'm going with this. I have to retrace my steps and get back to the last good point and then go again. So I kept on rewriting certain interactions, and when I was bringing in new characters, that was difficult as well. So I began writing the book with mostly the idea that there would be these two main characters, James and his friend Luke. But then the more I wrote, the more their families kind of came into play. And James has this younger brother, parents. Luke has this family background. His father is in prison, and his mum has moved to France. So he feels himself to have been abandoned by his parents. And the more those kind of complexities came in, the more I found it hard to find the scene in which you could give voice to those ideas without them feeling forced into the book. Yeah. I guess that's the challenge of novels or all writing, you know.
No, absolutely. I guess moving to France is a prison unto itself.
Yeah.
So it's sort of
Yeah.
over. A lot of this book is about shame, in essence. Something that I was so impressed by, and I felt as if this really makes the book unique among a lot of contemporary queer literature, is James is already out at the opening of the book. He is not dealing with the questions of desire as much as he is how to implement that desire and how to fit in within that desire. What made you like, I mean, he's 16 in the book. To me, that in 2002, that seems like an advanced age.
Yeah.
I think we're close in age, and I certainly was not out whatsoever. So what made you sort of jump over the self-discovery aspect of that, if you will, and sort of focus on the fact that it makes him an outcast in his own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, you know, you have to contain a book, and coming out is like a story in itself. And I just quickly decided that that was unnecessary information to the story that I was telling, which was really about James trying to grapple with what love is doing to his imagination, I think, because as he falls in love, the line between fiction and reality kind of blurs for him, because he's trying to figure out if the person he loves him back or not, and he can't tell. And so he begins to kind of spin these fantasies out. And I wanted him to feel isolated, because I knew that in that way his imagination would be what he had. And James has to imagine this kind of perfect person to fall in love with, the perfect future that they will unlock for him, the perfect life beyond the life that he has. And he doesn't really have confidence for that process. So he's kind of this entirely self-contained imagination machine, and he's running into overdrive in this book. So yeah, he has shame, and I think shame is something that is very close to embarrassment for James as well, because so for context, you haven't read the book. Luke, his friend, James doesn't know if he's straight or gay. He doesn't know if he loves him back or not. He's trying to figure out what it would look like if he was more than a friend, and how to kind of figure that out. And in order to figure that out, James, I think in some ways, debases himself for Luke. You know, he kind of comes with scraps of things that he thinks Luke might like, or versions of himself that he thinks Luke might like, to try and get to try and test the response. So at one point he kind of like finds a porn magazine and brings it to Luke, because he almost just wants to gift him something and be proximate to Luke's desire, whether he's involved in it or not. And then obviously he goes home and he's questioning the ethics of what he's done, and whether he's actually just diverted Luke's desire in another direction, and so his embarrassment and shame kind of build up. Yeah, he's very in his head.
Very relatable. I would love to hear, like, Luke is this really fascinating and dynamic and dangerous character, and he's quite hot seeming, which is always a great writerly trick. You know, most writers, I'm not going to project onto you, but most writers write their main characters as sort of nervous people, because we are nervous people. So how did you approach writing, you know, this kind of beautiful and dangerous person that is potentially very bad for James? You know, it goes beyond sort of a bad influence in the, you know, his mother would be worried way. It's about, you know, James not having the self-awareness to protect himself in all the ways. So how did you approach writing that?
I think you have to in some way fall in love with your character. So I try. I'm glad you think he's hot. I never have a clear idea of who the character is until I kind of write my way into finding that out. So it was only, 2/3 of the way into the first draft that I began to get a clear picture of what Luke looked like, and what it was about him that James would be attracted to. And in some ways, James is attracted to Luke's seeming like self-possession, his confidence, his masculinity as James sees it, because James is kind of struggling with not quite knowing where he fits in terms of gender roles, so Luke could be kind of the repository of everything that James wanted himself to be. He's kind of idolizing Luke, and in that way, I maybe tried to make the reader idolize Luke a little bit as well, because you can see the attraction there. And I think that, you say Luke is dangerous, and I agree, because he is a way of James just imagining this entire other life that he might live, but this other life is entirely dependent on Luke saying yes. And so he's kind of throwing himself repeatedly at Luke, trying to break his way into this new life, and Luke is the gateway to it. So, and poor Luke is just kind of wandering around sometimes. If you write a first-person narrative, you're only inside James's head. But I think if it was a third-person narrative, you would see Luke wandering around as James is just having these breakdowns, just losing the run of himself. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I think the first person is again very accomplished. As you can tell, I like the book quite a good deal. It's very accomplished in that I feel as though a lot of coming-of-age novels have this sort of condescension towards youth, because being young is inherently embarrassing. Being 15 and 16 is inherently embarrassing. And when you're embarrassed of your past, it's really easy to kind of just be like, that was all so ridiculous. Like, let me lampoon it, even just a little. But I felt like you really embodied the urgency of emotion, and gave it real credit. Like, you treated it at an eye level, even though the book is in retrospect. Was that something you were conscious of as you were writing it? Did you revise it to get that way?
I don't really have much desire to burst the bubble of James's emotions, because I think that everyone has done it, and I think the only reason that we kind of cringe at our teenage selves is because we recognize something in them that we want to distance ourselves from now. And I think falling in love for the first time is this, operatic, vertiginous experience, because you have no context for it. You have no way of lampooning it, because you haven't felt it before. And often if someone tries to lampoon it while you're going through it, you react quite viciously against that, because you think that they don't understand. If someone says there will be other people that you fall in love with, you don't want to hear that, because there won't. It's always this first person. So I think if the novel had been lampooning James's emotions, it wouldn't have been true to his experience. So hopefully, it might make you might recognize yourself in it, and you might not like it. And sometimes I think novels should do that. I wanted James as a character to be able to think messy thoughts, and not necessarily to always have, his ethical code in place, and not always to be entirely likable to you, but nevertheless I want you to empathize with him. So he will say things and do things that you would not do yourself, but teenagers do that. So
I found it to be very generous. It felt like like an act of love to your main character and an act of love to the reader as well. Just to be that earnest, I thought it was really, really lovely. The novel is set in this town that I would say is like the boonies, basically. It's,
I don't know what that is.
I was getting to that. It's that and baseball metaphors that never land. It's like kind of the middle of nowhere, basically.
Okay.
And you expertly describe kind of the quotidian and like frustrating nature of growing up somewhere. I grew up in what we call the boonies here, and like, it's a hard place to be queer, I think. It's a hard place to write about being queer. And it's hard to make interesting when, in essence, the theme of it is being frustrated and bored in a frustrating and boring place. So, like, how did you approach that? How did you make it feel so alive? And it's not just used as kind of the cliche, this place is suffocating, it's taking everything from me. James does have some love for it, because it is making him as he's going.
Yeah, I mean, to come back to that earlier question of why coming out wasn't part of the story, I often think in queer literature, like the city is the place of liberation, and like by the time your character arrives at the city, that is when life begins. That is when they find community, or that is when they kind of explore themselves. But I was interested in not including that. You don't see James leave. This is a place where it's isolated and everyone knows each other's business. So James feels very known, or not in a good way. Teenagers like to keep secrets, and he doesn't feel able to keep secrets in the place that he is. But I also wanted to have a place in which James would feel that life wouldn't start until he made it start. The village is holding him in this sort of stasis, and James is trying to push against it. He talks a few times about wanting to start living, or finding a way for life to start, or for the clock to start. So Thornmere, that's the name of the village. That's what it does for him. But it also, I hadn't really seen much in the way of pastoral queer literature. I couldn't really think of many examples of queer novels where the main setting is the countryside. And so, by dint of that, I wanted to write it. I think I said to someone as I was first writing the book that it would be Edmund White meets Thomas Hardy, and that was like the collision I wanted.
Publicity loved that pitch.
Yes, sure. Yeah. So, I wanted this small town, which nevertheless had aspects of freedom written into it, because beyond it is fields and woodlands, and the characters can wander and kind of invent a form of life for themselves. And it didn't need to be, a pre-established community. I was quite interested in how people find their way when they're on their own, and don't have a roadmap.
Yeah. I feel as though the kind of like sparseness and, I don't know, woodsiness, it's not the right term, but whatever, of it, like it allowed you, there are two moments in the book that you have to buy it to read them. I'm not going to give it to you for free. That you push this concept of like bodily shame and embarrassment to this almost phantasmagoric level. And there's two scenes that I found like actively scary.
Okay.
And it's a compliment, don't worry. Okay. And I'm so curious, because that's not something I see a lot in queer literature in particular, of this, it's sort of benign moments turning into this manifestation of just the internal anxiety and terror. These are always kind of annoying questions, but how did you go about writing scenes that were sort of askew, that still felt very in line with the rest of the novel because they're less romantic than the rest, or they're less pining oriented.
Yeah, so I had this idea that the novel in my head would be kind of bright and summery and about love.
Right.
And that was, idea number one. And then idea number two came that love and terror are very intertwined. And so running through the novel, which is perhaps what you're talking about, I don't know, there are these moments at which Luke thinks that his father is being let out of prison and coming back to get him. And he tells James this, and the two of them begin to think that they see someone at night, or James kind of sees a face when he's in the woods, but he doesn't know if he's imagined it. And that was part, to me, of the sort of uncanniness of his anxiety, because he begins to think that the perfect life that he's imagining for himself is not under his control, and that there are other forces trying to undo that life just as he's inventing it. He doesn't think he's inventing it, but just as he is, there is, someone's father coming to take away the person that he loves, or and at one point James imagines Luke almost hallucinating James being there. There are these kind of dreamlike replacements that James goes through, and at other times he kind of wonders what it would be like if Luke just could pretend that James was a girl. Sorry. So what would it matter that much? And he's kind of asking of the universe and of his own, mind, what is the difference? Like, if I were just a girl, or if Luke could just pretend I was a girl, wouldn't everything be okay then? So he's kind of desperately trying to replace himself or take on different forms. So yeah, that kind of uncanny element, I think, is part and parcel of the madness of being in love and not being able to obtain the thing that you are pining after.
Yeah, that's it's a great answer. You're good at this. That's such an interesting thing you're touching on, of James putting himself in, for lack of a better term, the mentality or positioning himself and wondering what it would be like to be a straight woman, and how men would interact him, and specifically treat his body with that. I found that to be very compelling and bold and very well done. I feel as though most queer writers get the masculinity question all the time, but how did you, I guess, what was the impetus on that beyond sort of the idea of use or engagement or whatever, sort of it felt as though James was really questioning his gender role in the world on top of how his body would be. Yeah,
I think what James is questioning his gender role, and I don't always think he's doing it in, this is kind of where I think his ethics are skewed, but he is a teenager and we forgive him his taking on of the world's assumptions. But basically, so far as I see it, James, and this is partly how I feel sometimes about masculinity. When people ask me about masculinity, I always think of that as a thing over there that I am not really part of. Right. And so I feel like an observer of masculinity rather than a masculine person, which is not true, but I think it just speaks to the kind of smallness of how we imagine masculinity. James feels that the boys that he is so desperate to kind of be close to have this kind of potential for violence or potential for cruelty. But nevertheless, when they're alone together, he sees them kind of hugging each other or talking closely to each other. And all James wants is to be allowed inside that place of being hugged by another boy or being close to them. But he knows that he can never get inside because all of the boys won't let him come close because he's gay, and they don't want that kind of suspicion on themselves. They don't want to hug him because they don't want to be called something. So James is kind of locked out from the other boys at school. And I think, if I was psychoanalyzing my own character, I think what he begins to see is the girls on one side and the boys on the other, and the gaze of desire is going between them. And James just wants to kind of stand near the girls, so at least then the gaze of desire will fall onto him. And so he's trying to imagine what it would be like to be on the receiving end of male desire. And the only way he can kind of conceptualize that is, I would have to be a girl. And so his mind is kind of doing these somersaults around his own gender identity. And it's all this kind of deeply hormonal desire just to be looked at.
Yeah, that's just beautiful. I'm very curious what your like North Star texts or songs or whatever, the things you would turn to when you were having a dark night of the soul, or as I call it, every night of my life. One of the books that I think is lurking behind this book, and it only became clear to me after I'd already written most of this book, which is good, because if it had become clear to me earlier on, I would have just rewritten that book badly. Maybe I have, but was L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, which, if you don't know it, is about a young boy who goes to stay at this like big country estate with his friend, and he starts to idolize all of the people that live on the estate, and he sees them as all members of the zodiac, and his friend's older sister, Marion, becomes the Virgin, the Virgo in the zodiac, and Leo, the main character, is asked by Marion to take a message to this farmer, and as a reader, you know that Marion and this farmer are conducting an affair, but Leo doesn't quite know that, so he just enjoys his place in the kind of hierarchy of things, and it's set over this brilliant summer. But the reason that became a kind of lodestar for me was there is a restraint that runs all the way through that book, that detonates in like one final image that I read when I was about 15 or 16, and I could, like, the image is still in my head, even though it's a strange one. It's like an umbrella opening and closing, the shadow of an umbrella opening and closing, but it's actually two people having sex, but he sees the shadow on the wall, and like his life is destroyed from that point. And I wanted to know how to hold back for so long that you can detonate around a small point in a book. And so that book was like my lodestar. And I also just think it's so atmospheric. I wanted to write a book in which you felt that you were fully immersed in an atmosphere. And if you read The Go-Between, you will feel like it's summertime. And I think it's a perfect book. I love it. Sounds great. You should, work in sales if this doesn't pan out.
Yeah.
This is a totally selfish question. The names in this book, James and Luke in particular, they're incredibly simple biblical names and whatnot, but they're somehow so perfect. Like Luke, it just has that sort of blunt masculinity to it.
I'm glad you think that. I was trying to make this case the other day that Luke is like a hot person's name. Right. And I have no explanation.
I've never met an ugly Luke. So
there you go.
Was that something that came early on? Like when you thought of Luke, were you just like, that's it? Or because names are hard, I
think he was always called Luke. I can't really remember a time at which he wasn't. And and James, I think, was always called James, and no offense to any Jameses in here, but the reason I called him James was because I thought it was such an unobtrusive name, and James is almost a character who, at many points in the book wants to disappear or feels not noticed, and so I gave him, if I'd have given him the name like Elijah, you would have paid attention to him, but his name's James. And like so many other people in the world, he's just another James. But yeah, Luke is hot. I think. Yeah,
we can all agree. My last thing before we'll switch it over to audience, I think we're about there. But I'm sure you get this a lot. The impetus behind the title, and like, do you find titles easy? Do you enjoy them?
I don't find titles easy. And I usually, I would have like a working title, or sometimes not even that. And I usually only fully decide on the title after I've already written the book, which makes your job really difficult because then you feel that you have to encapsulate everything in the book, which is impossible. The title came from, when I kind of surveyed the book at the end, I was just asking myself what I thought the book was about. And I kind of came to the conclusion that it was about imagining these kind of perfect places and lives and the things that the main character does to try and get inside or to try and knock his way through into that perfect world that he's imagining. So I was reading William Blake because I was looking for something that was on like innocence and experience vibes, and also that might bring the pastoral element of the book in. So I have this epigraph from Blake's Milton, which is one of his unreadable, very long epic poems, in which he talks about all the flowers kind of opening. He says opening their heavens, like opening their petals, and they're all pollinating freely, and everything is like free love. But men are sick with love, is the way the poem goes. And I added the comma in there because I didn't want opening your heavens. What does that mean? I wanted a sense of command. So. I kind of imagine this as a book in which you have characters trying to knock their way through into heaven or command heaven to open.
I was wondering how you transitioned from poetry to memoir to fiction, and if you approach those. I know you spoke a little bit about how you try to get a poem down in a day, and you can't do that with a novel. But I was just wondering how you approach those styles of writing differently and how you approach them in the same ways.
That's a great question. Thanks. I think with poetry, my main concern, aside from what the poem is, officially about, or I think it's about, sometimes that doesn't even matter to me. Sound and kind of energy are the most important things. You could have 10,000 poems about a butterfly, but the best one is the best. This is the one that sounds best and feels best to read, and so that's kind of my guiding principle. And the sound is also the way I organize the form of the poem and revise the poem. So it's always kind of oral in that way. Whereas with prose, I think it's a much more obviously like architectural way of thinking. So you have a structure. And I think in some ways, once you have the structure, you just begin to fill it in. So I don't always write like start to finish. I didn't write the novel start to finish. Sometimes if I got stuck on a scene, I would just skip through to another part of the book and write there and come back. So in that way, it's a bit more forgiving of your energy, a novel. But also, you have to sustain belief in it for like 3 years or how long it takes you to write it, whereas you only have to really sustain belief in a poem for like an hour or 2 hours, and then it's there, and you either give up on it and see that it's a bad poem, or it has something to it and you can carry on working on it, and eventually it's done. So those are the key differences. I think I still, as I revised this, I still read it aloud to myself because that's the way I edit things. So even though no one is going to read the novel aloud, or there is a great audiobook, but most people don't read the novel aloud. Nevertheless, I'm kind of like unsatisfied with a sentence if I don't think it sounds good. So that's one thing that I kind of pull between. But I think in some ways, a poem is a sort of liberating thing in terms of its sound. I find them energizing, and a novel is a liberating thing in terms of you can just invent anything. And I found that, in some ways, the limitlessness of that is terrifying, but it's also a very galvanizing limitlessness. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask, was it more vulnerable for you to write a memoir, or was it more vulnerable to make up a story and have everyone believe that it was real?
A memoir, for sure. Yeah, I wouldn't advise writing a memoir. It is, even if you think that you're fully prepared for it, I don't think you can be, because the only way I think you can survive the writing of a memoir is to completely detach yourself from the book afterwards. As in, it's a book now, it's not me. Because otherwise you have this sense of like a severed part of your psyche is floating off around in the world and everyone's judging it. You can't really think like that. You have to just say a book is floating around in the world. With fiction, you have so many layers of mystification that you can say, part of it is me if it's a good thing, and if people don't like it, then that's definitely fiction. And no one can prove you wrong. Whereas with a memoir, like you're kind of signing this contract with the reader that you're being honest with them, and so you can't go around saying, actually, that didn't happen, because that's not the deal. So definitely a memoir. A memoir is worse.
Let's give these folks a round of applause.